Filed away in the holdings of the Biblioteca Casanatense in Rome, an early modern codex preserves a unique glimpse into the vanished world of elite women in 16th century Yemen. In a pair of folios from the Codex Casanatense, MS 1889, an image of a richly robed woman stands poised between flowering plants, while two smaller female attendants approach her with offerings. The Portuguese caption above her head to the right reads, Mulheres de Radaa, a phrase misread until now by scholars as women of Shiraz. I propose instead a direct reading of the text, that these are women of Radaa, a city in Lower Yemen, and in the 15th and early 16th centuries, the capital of the thriving Tahirid Sultanate. This paper begins by framing this correction of the Codex Casanatense's misidentification as a feminist intervention, one that seeks to recover the historical specificity of this image, as well as the legacy of female agency in a 16th century Islamic context otherwise lost to the art historical canon. In analyzing this image through colonial lenses, Yemen's architectural record, and transcultural aesthetics, its subjects emerge not as mere figures of ethno-geographic interest, but as women tied to specific parameters of power, place, and presence. The Codex Casanatense is an unbound set of 71 watercolor illustrations produced in colonial Goa in the mid-16th century that depict paired figures representing the diverse peoples the Portuguese encountered in their maritime expansion. The manuscript is attributed to at least one, and possibly multiple, classically trained Indian artists, yet annotated in two visibly different early modern Portuguese hands. That hybrid, collaborative nature of the images make this collection exceptional in the visual record of the European couples and customs schematic, an established ethnographic visual mode colonial powers used to classify and ultimately exert control over the people, lands, and resources they encountered. An early example of this convention is pinpointed to Hans Berkmer's long woodcut frieze, Peoples of Africa and India, or the Trachten book of artist Christopher Weiditz from the late 1520s that depicted figures from the Iberian Peninsula with key resemblances to other widely circulating European customs books. However, the 12th century Pentecost mosaic in the Basilica San Marco in Venice uses this paired schematic with varying costumes and complexions many centuries earlier to depict different nations. This enduring pictorial format ultimately figured European concepts about inhabitants of the New World and Africa, as evidenced in John White's painted depictions of the natives of Virginia, and descriptions by Duarte Lopez and Filippo Pigafetta of the Kingdom of Congo. The folios of the Codex Casanatense introduce its readers to the 16th century Portuguese maritime empire, from the coast of East Africa to the Red Sea, around the Arabian Peninsula into the Persian Gulf, and onward to India and eventually China. The numbers in the upper corner of the folio are probably not original to its earliest version, since discrepancies have been highlighted in its scholarship, but their present sequence supports the assignation of folios 19 and 20, the women of Radaa, to the Arabian Peninsula. Preceding the women of Radaa are representatives of East Africa, merchants from Mecca, Fartakis warriors of the Red Sea, two varieties of Arab sailors and coastal Bedouins. Directly following the women of Radaa are Rumi, or Turks of the Red Sea, and marshland Arabs. Further into the Codex, Mesopotamian and Persian themes unfold, including another double folio captioned, people that are called Shirazes, Moors from the Kingdom of Shiraz, whose lord is Sheikh Ismail. Located within this later segment, folios 33 and 34. This later folio is the only correct depiction of the people of Shiraz, located further east in Persia, while the women of Radaa represent a unique scene of elite women in the inland capital of the Tahirid dynasty that ruled Lower Yemen from the 15th through the early 16th century. One detail complicates this otherwise straightforward adjustment to the reading of the women of Radaa. A secondary Portuguese caption, in a different, right-slanted and cursive hand that contrasts with the straight letters above, places the scene in Syria. This is well outside of the geographical itinerary of the Portuguese, sailing east to west from Africa to India, and it seems to be a feeble attempt to make sense of a subject that has baffled this later interlocutor as it has baffled the Codex's later scholars who place these women in Shiraz. The amount of time that passed between the first Portuguese caption writer and the second is unknown, but in that span, the world had shifted. Portuguese maritime ambitions in the beginning of the 16th century were no longer a political reality by mid-century, when their ships had been repelled and even the Tahirid dynasty in Yemen had ceased to exist. The Codex Casanatense's images follow more or less the circa 1516 itinerary of the Portuguese explorer Duarte Barbosa, who documents the bustling trade and economic prosperity of Yemen's ports under the Tahirid dynasty's control. Zabid, Maha, Mocha, Hodeida, and most important of all, Aden, an ancient and important port described as early as the 1st century CE by a Greek navigational manual. Expanding upon the range and violence of early Portuguese explorers, Vasco da Gama and Tristan da Cunha, the Portuguese captain Alfonso de Albuquerque set fire to Aden's harbor in 1511 and massacred the crews of merchant ships. This event was commemorated in a Flemish woodcut of 1513, now held by the British Museum. However, by 1513, under Tahirid rule, the ancient Sira fortress by the harbor was fortified, and its inhabitants successfully repelled the European invaders. Yemen would have no part in the nascent Portuguese thalassocracy that colonized India, the Spice Islands, and Asia as far as Japan. Consequently, Yemen in time disappeared from colonial maps and documents, like the Codex Angelica, MS 1551, in the Biblioteca Angelica in Rome. This is another Portuguese illustrated codex of people and places in the style of the Codex Casanatense, but although undated, it is assigned a later time frame because of the subtle differences in its subjects. While most of the Codex Angelica overlaps with the Codex Casanatense, it includes Japan for the first time and entirely omits the people and places of the Red Sea and South Arabian coastlines. By the time the Codex Angelica was created and the secondary captions on the Codex Casanatense were imposed upon its illustrations, Portuguese ships had bypassed well-defended Yemeni ports in favor of easier conquests farther east. Whereas earlier Portuguese explorers wrote detailed reports about the South Arabian coastline and the Tahirid trade networks that they hoped to dominate, works like the later Codex Angelica fell silent about the region by mid-century. As the result of its resistance, Yemen had fallen off the early modern European colonial map. Radaa, the inland capital of the Tahirid dynasty in the early 16th century, is an exceptional inclusion in colonial records that typically only mention coastal port cities of Lower Yemen. However, by mid-century, when Yemen disappeared from European illustrated ethnographies, Radaa had already lost its status as the capital of a powerful sultanate. Ironically, the last Tahirid sultan, Amir ibn Abd al-Wahid, who reigned from 1489 to 1517, had successfully resisted Portuguese attempts at colonization and ongoing coastal skirmishes. But his defensive alliance with the Ottoman commander Salman Rais and his 6,000 Mamluk soldiers ultimately brought about the collapse of Lower Yemen's last indigenous ruling dynasty. Alternating periods in the next centuries saw Lower Yemen at the unstable margins of the Ottoman Empire or administered by the Qasimi line of the Zaydi Imamate that ruled from Sana'a in Upper Yemen until 1962. In accounts of the collapse of the Tahirid dynasty and the royal family's flight from Radaa and their inland strongholds, a staggering picture emerges of the wealth and luxury that the Codex Casanatense depicts. The court chronicler of the Tahirids, Abu Makrama, wrote that their vast riches distracted the army and permitted the Sultan Amir to make his escape. Amidst the plunder, a year's worth of revenue from the port of Aden, 500,000 gold dinars, was discovered hidden in the Tahirid castle's walls. The retreating Egyptian army, weighted down with treasure, was raided by the Yemeni tribesmen of the Banu Hoshesh, whose giddy accounts of 3,000 camel loads of gold, silver, jewels, gems, and luxury clothes and goods account for only a fraction of the Tahirids' total wealth. As late as 1528, when the army of the Zaydi Imam Mutahhar plundered Tahirid holdings yet again, there still remained valuable assets in the form of guns, weapons, manuscripts, Chinese porcelain, and bronzes inlaid with silver. After the collapse of the Tahirid Sultanate and the withdrawal of the Portuguese in the first half of the 16th century, it's not surprising that the name of the looted inland capital would fall into obscurity and perplex the later Portuguese orthographer as well as contemporary scholars. The anonymous illustrator of the Codex Casanatense captures the last flash of the Radaa of the Tahirids before the extinction of the dynasty and the dispersal of their famed wealth. The women of Radaa all wear a double band of gold around their necks, and the larger elite woman on the right displays multiple gold bangles on both wrists. Layered garments, richly dyed crimson and yellow and invested with a subtle vegetal pattern, under a sheer, semi-transparent full-body veil, convey the wealth of the latter, as does the presence of her two serving girls, dressed in undyed clothing that mark their station. This double folio preserves a unique representation of elite female agency in the Islamic world at the very moment when their political and social world collapsed. The task then is not only to reposition this image historically, but to read it critically as a site where gender, power, and empires intersect. Elite women of the Tahirid dynasty in Yemen exercised power beyond the sumptuous materials depicted in the Codex Casanatense. From the 11th century mosque of the Sulayhid Queen Arwa in Jibla, an established and respected precedent of elite female-endowed monumental mosques existed in Yemen. In many respects, the ruling Tahirids emulated the forms of government and patronage of their direct predecessors, the Rasulids, who are credited with ushering a golden age of courtly civilization, scientific advancements, and material culture to medieval Yemen. Royal women of the preceding dynasty were responsible for the proliferation of mosques in Taiz, Zabid, and other cities of Lower Yemen. Two female-commissioned religious schools, or madrasas, still stand in Zabid, the Fatiniya from the 14th century and the Farhaniya of the 15th century. One notable instance of Rasulid patronage saw not only the construction of one mosque, 3 madrasas, and 1 khanqa, a Sufi hostel, by a royal woman, but also the construction of 3 separate mosques in Zabid by each of her female slaves. This precedent opens an intriguing line of speculation about the inclusion of the 2 serving girls adjacent to the elite woman in the Codex Casanatense, and the theoretical potential for them to be patrons of mosques in their own right. In the Rasulid era, however, only one instance of this is known, and no comparable example from an elite Tahirid household has been identified. In the more limited record of the patronage of monumental religious buildings by elite Tahirid women, one example stands out. The last Tahirid sultan, whose defeat by Ottoman and Mamluk forces was detailed a short while ago, maintained 3 wives in the 3 principal inland cities of his sultanate, Juban, Mukarana, as well as Radaa. Modern inhabitants of Radaa remember one crumbling mosque from the 16th century as the endowment of this last Tahirid ruler's resident wife. It is called the Baghdadiya Mosque, named after the memory of this royal woman's place of birth. This is the only detail known about this royal woman, whose dynastic fame inspired the depiction of the luxurious women of Radaa in the Codex Casanatense. No personal name of the Radaa-based wife of the last Tahirid Sultan is recorded in Yemeni histories. This is not exceptional. Long-standing Islamic conventions surrounding feminine modesty and a fiercely protective sensitivity to domestic privacy would have made the direct naming of any royal or elite woman an anomaly rather than the expectation. Royal women of the preceding Rasulid dynasty had a unique nomenclature that passed their identity, if not their personal name, into the historical record via their architectural endowments. This naming convention relied on the Rasulids' involvement in the East African slave trade, which saw a coveted new status symbol emerge from castration centers in northeastern Sudan and elsewhere, the black eunuch. These deracinated, enslaved Africans could rise to positions of great political power in medieval Yemen, and they were integral to royal female households, where they could number between 10 to 63. There were clear hierarchies in these households, and the head eunuch gave his name to the royal Rasulid woman in public-facing works and documents. The senior eunuch, named Jamal ad-Din Mutab al-Ashrafi, in the household of the Rasulid Sultan al-Ashraf's wife and mother to his successor, for instance, becomes the root of the royal woman's public-facing name, Jihat Mutab. The Mutabiya Madrasa, still extant in Taiz today, is an endowment named after her without invoking a personal name directly. Similarly, the two Rasulid madrasas in Zabid, mentioned above, the Fatiniya and the Farhaniya, were built by Jihat Fatin and Jihat Farhan. The later Baghdadiya Mosque in Radaa has abandoned this earlier naming convention, yet the substitution of the Tahirid Sultana's city of origin for a name performs the same function as a kind of veil between the royal woman and her public memory. Architecturally, endowments of mosques and madrasas by royal Rasulid and Tahirid women are as closely connected to the monuments of their ruling husbands as they are to one another. The Mutabiya's madrasa's formal similarities to the Ashrafiyya, the landmark Rasulid mosque erected by the Sultan al-Ashraf in Taiz as well, ground historians' speculations that they shared the same designer. Furthermore, the Mutabiya's raised clerestory has been proposed as the direct model for later Tahirid madrasas 2 centuries later. The Amiriya Mosque and Madrasa bears the name of the last Tahirid Sultan Amir, whose wife in the same city lent her memory and identity to the Baghdadiya Madrasa. Mirroring the Rasulid precedent in this respect as well, the Baghdadiya and Amiriya in Radaa share key forms, both decorative and structural, from rows of white domes that mark the roof of the prayer hall to the distinctive crenellations above their walls and tower. In the Rasulid era, the Ashrafiyya's large dimensions and central dome, which earned it a comparison to Rome's Pantheon by one early modern traveler, dominate the skyline compared to the more diminutive Mutabiyya. Similarly, in Tahirid Radaa, the stately, expansive Amiriya is many times the size of the Baghdadiya. Against the odds of war and time, all 4 of these mosques are still standing in Yemen today, in varied states of conservation. Both Sultan's mosques, the Ashrafiyya in Taiz and the Amiriya in Radaa, have been the subject of extensive restoration campaigns by multinational initiatives. Their wives, smaller madrasas, have not yet received equal treatment. The Mutabiyya received less extensive intervention, while the Baghdadiya languishes in obscurity and neglect. The splendor revealed by the restored Amiria, however, offers some idea of what this royal Tahirid women's mosque might have once looked like, from its shining white plastered exterior to the intricate stucco work and painted murals within. In Yemeni histories and memory, centered around monumental mosques and madrasas, the presence of elite women is felt, but testimony of their individual lives and identities is limited. In a medieval Muslim society, which favored geometric styles of art and decoration over the figurative and representational, no images of elite women have come to light. Instead, the visual record of European colonization generated the only known depiction of these women of Radaa. When its Tahirid and Yemeni context is restored, an extraordinary transcultural artifact is revealed within the folios of the Codex Casanatense, shaped by the overlapping knowledge systems of South Asian artists, Portuguese scribes, and Yemeni architectural traditions. Not only a rare image of elite Islamic womanhood, but also a defiant fragment of a Yemeni sultanate that resisted absorption into European colonial frameworks until it collapsed due to imperial pressures closer to home. In many ways, the Women of Radaa double folio articulates many of the stakes that have been set out for a transcultural and feminist art history, such as the instability of the colonial gaze and the agency of non-European subjects outlined by Saloni Mathur. This paper has attempted such an approach by restoring the specificity of the women of Radaa, reframing them not as ethnographic types, but as powerful political actors whose monumental legacies complicate the narratives imposed upon them. In this act of recovery can be glimpsed a different image of womanhood in medieval Yemen and a new vision for a global art history, with the women of Tahirid Radaa at the center rather than the margins. Thank you.